Tonight's art demonstration is provided in partnership with the DuPage Art League. Founded over 60 years ago, the DuPage Art League is dedicated to promoting and encouraging the visual arts through classes, workshops, gallery exhibits, and public programs such as this one. We are grateful to the DuPage Art League for arranging tonight's demonstration by acclaimed artist Faith Humphrey Hill. Faith Humphrey Hill is a portrait artist combining knitting and drawing with digital tools. Her work includes portraits that are drawn in Procreate and then reconfigured into knit prints, knit animations, and knit tapestries as tall as 7 feet. She holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a master's in arts management from Columbia College. Her work has been published, collected, and exhibited internationally. Faith, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And now I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share screen now. Okay. So yeah, my name is Faith Humphrey Hill, and my website is dartily.com. So that's art and daily combined to make the word dartily. And as mentioned, I'm a portrait artist, and I combine knitting and drawing with digital tools. I have a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And while I was a student there, I really focused on charcoal and oil painting and working in a representational style. So I did lots of figure drawing, lots of figure painting, working from life and that sort of thing. But another thing I did while I was a student was I was really active in the student-run galleries. So I was a director there, and I would showcase the artwork by my peer students. And we did have an exhibition of the fiber art students, which is when I first got introduced to knitting. They would come in for all of our exhibition meetings. They all got their needles and they were knitting their different projects. And I just thought it looked magical. And that's when I was like, okay, at some point I'm going to learn how to knit. So after I finished my undergrad, I went on and I worked in different galleries and museums and different organizations around Chicago. And during that time, I ended up getting my master's in arts management from Columbia College. Then after I graduated, I had my first child, and I was struggling to balance, work and motherhood with oil painting and charcoal. It was just, they were such messy mediums, and I only had little nap times where I could fit it in. So I was like, I want a creative outlet that, like, first of all, is mentally challenging, but also something that I can kind of just pick up and work on and then put down when I need to tend to the kids. So I taught myself how to knit. So I learned from books, and I started knitting things like hats and scarves and socks and things like that. So as I continued my career, for 20 years, I was in different leadership positions in arts organizations, and I would still had my studio practice going on. And over time, I was able to reintroduce drawing and charcoal, and I was continuing to knit as well. And then I was able to make the change to becoming a full-time artist 7 years ago. And that's when I was introduced to digital tools like Procreate for drawing. And so that allowed me to work digitally. I was not interested in working digitally when I was in art school. The technology wasn't as responsive, and all the work being produced looked very kind of glossy. And that wasn't really the look I was going for. But once I was able to work on my art full time, and I was exposed to what some of these people were doing with the digital tools nowadays, I was really impressed by how natural and organic it looked. So I started experimenting with digital tools and Procreate to see what I could do with the drawing. And I really loved it. I loved that it was portable. I loved that I could, I didn't need to go run to the store to pick up a certain color that I ran out of or anything like that. And storage was easy instead of, I have boxes and boxes of art that I've made over the years. And it's nice that now it's all nice contained in a digital format. So once I started doing the drawings, then I started to incorporate the knitting with them. And that was an idea I was starting to get in because I was drawing and I was knitting. And so, my knit portraits, some of the main concepts behind them is that I want to celebrate our common thread. I want to combine the visual symbolism of knitting with the expressive rendering of drawing. to create a comfort and familiarity between viewer and subject, though they may be strangers. And my work provides an optimistic view of technology's role in shaping our identity and relationships. So I was working, making art full time, and I was drawing, and then my knitting was on the side, and I was exhibiting my portraits, and people were very interested in looking at them and stuff. But they were also interested in the little socks I was knitting, because I was like walking around knitting my socks, talking to people. And they would make comments to me like, oh, like so-and-so, my aunt used to knit, and oh, I have this scarf she made, and every time I wear it, it's like a hug, or oh, it looks so relaxing and meditative, like just all these really positive words they associated with knitting. So after that event, I went back to the studio and I was reflecting on everything that people were saying. And I was thinking about all those words, and I was like, I want them to associate all of that with these portraits that I'm making of people who are strangers to, the viewer. I want them to feel that comfort and that familiarity. And I started thinking even more about my relationship with knitting and what knitting means to me. And to me, knitting is a binary code, being just knits and purls. It's like dashes and O's. And it's the first textile my children touched when they were born, right? Like gave birth to them and they put a little knit hat on them, and in technology, they love to work with, in textile technology, they love to work with knitting more so than weaving or macrame or crochet or anything like that, because it's this continuous flow of the fibers. They're not knotted really tight. They don't crisscross each other. So they can put currents and things to them because they have a flow. So I really loved all those different concepts that get kind of connected with knitting, and to me seem related to us as people and our relationships with each other. So in the art that I make now as a full-time artist, I really have like 4 series that I work on. I have drawings, and all the work I do starts with drawings. And then I have knit prints, knit arts, which are my knit tapestries, and knit animations. I have a little video here. And so here you can see a little bit of my process of drawing in Procreate, and I'll go through it in greater detail in a minute. Working in Procreate allowed me to work in layers. That made it easy for me to incorporate the knitting into the pieces. And that's a little sneak peek at the knitting machine that is behind me in action as I thread it up with 6 colors, which I'll go through in a second too. So kind of a sneak peek of what all those different processes look like in order to get to some of these pieces in these series. So let's start with the first step of my pieces, which is the drawing step, because they all begin with a drawing. So like I said, they're all done in Procreate in my iPad, so very portable. And for my portraits, I like to use reference photos I find from the museum app by Sketchy. So this is an app that's free. I think at this point, it's only available on Apple devices. They're working on an Android version of the app, but it's an artist-to-artist image sharing social media, really. We share, it's all artists, and we're all sharing pictures and snapshots we've taken that other artists are welcome to use in their artwork. So you kind of get past all the hype, all the copyright stuff and everything, because that's the whole point, is we're sharing images that other artists can use. And it's an international group on there, and there's tons and tons of pictures to choose from. It leans portrait, but there's tons of other pictures on there too, of like animals and places and still lives and things like that as well. And portraits. So I ended up landing on portraits for my artwork for several reasons. One, I always enjoyed working from life and working from the human figure as a subject. And also when I worked in the galleries and museums, I was often paying attention to the viewer's reaction to the artwork, because my desk was always in the exhibition space. So I could always see and respond to people as they were walking through the exhibitions. And I noticed that people were spending more time with the portraits than the other subject matter. And I actually even secretly timed people. I was like, I think they're spending more time with those pieces. So I timed them, and they were. And so that led to me, and we even had an exhibition that was just portraits. And so I timed it like how long the average viewer spent in the gallery with the exhibition before, the portrait exhibition, the exhibition after, my own little scientific analysis, and found that, yeah, they were spending more time with the portraits. So that led me to me doing some research on the viewer's experience. So I started reading about neuroaesthetics, and I got this book from MIT about it. And of all the art subject matters, only portraiture got its own chapter in the book because it was igniting more parts of the viewer's brain than the other subject matter. It was doing the visual side of the brain, but also the facial recognition side of the brain. I think also portraiture is a special subject matter because when you spend time looking at and studying other faces, you start to build empathy. You know, you start to really connect with other people. And, you know, for me, because I'm finding these faces on this app, I don't know anything about these subjects. I don't know where they live. I don't even know their names. They're complete strangers to me. And I love that because I'm a visual person and I'm a visual learner. So for me, it's really cool because I need to get to know them and understand who they are by spending time and studying them visually. And I think that's kind of skipping a step too, because, you know, if I'm going to present to the viewer an image of a person, you know, they don't have the background and the history. So it's kind of like a really direct message where I just have the visual information and then they get the visual information. And yeah, and it was funny during COVID and everything because, you know, I was spending so much time drawing portraits that I kind of wasn't like lonely. And I felt like I was meeting so many people still because I was drawing so many faces. And yeah, so it was really cool. I become really connected with all the people that I draw, because when you draw them and you spend that much time studying people's facial features, and I mean, it just says so much about who they are and what they've been through. And, you know, when you draw them, you start to kind of mirror, you know, like I'm sure you've seen cartoonists do it, you kind of mirror their expression and their feelings. And so I kind of find that I mirror it too. And it just makes me feel really connected to them. So here's a little video about my entire drawing process. So like I said, all my series starts with a drawing before I ever knit it and turn it into something else. And so first of all, I select an image through the museum app by Sketchy, which is what this is. And I never work with an image straight. I always edit it. And so this is in just the Photos app on my phone or on my iPad. And I do things like I crop it, I change the like saturation, the contrast. I just start to kind of get a senses to my vision for where I want to take it and I want it to look. I like to work with the grid method when I work on my iPad like this with the reference photos. But I keep the grid really big because, pause that for a sec. I like to keep the grid really big because it's really important to me that the mark making still shows. I find that when people trace, like they hold the pencil a little differently and it gets too uptight and we start to lose the artist mark making. And I don't want that to happen. So I keep the grid really big so that you still see my mark making as the artist. And I'm only putting it there really to replace some of the larger measurements that I would be able to do if I was working with a live subject. So like when I do figure drawing, I'll stand behind an easel and I'll measure with my pencil and find different proportional relationships. So I use the grid to kind of help with some of those bigger measurements since I'm working just on one little screen, you know, and sometimes if I'm like on an airplane or on the train, it's like on my lap and I don't have a lot of space to kind of measure things. I do think tracing has its place though, and it can be a great way to study faces. So I do think that has a place in certain areas, but I don't recommend it for finished pieces like something like this. So yeah, so it's really easy in Procreate to add a grid to the image and then to your canvas. And then I work with 3 layers. I work with an underpainting layer, a line drawing layer, and a crosshatch layer. So first step is working on the line layer. So I go ahead and do a rough sketch of the piece. That's what I'm doing here. Just kind of mapping it out. And when I work in Procreate, I'm really just working with very few pencils. I'm working with the 6B brush, and I keep it at, you can see over here, that's full width. So it's a really big brush that's full width, and then it's full opacity. And I really don't change those at all. So I really keep it very simple for Procreate. And then I refine my drawing. So I go through and just kind of clean it up. I really believe it's important to have a solid drawing to start with, because if you have the proportions right and everything, then you can get really wild and expressive with your colors later on. So I try to really nail that down. Plus, I really enjoy that part of it. I love studying, like, the fingers and the shapes and trying to get them just right. I get excited about that level of drawing. And so, yeah, what's nice on Procreate too is you can see this is a screen recording, and you can see how I can just use my fingers to rotate my drawing canvas. This is an interesting photo to work from because you can barely see the eyes. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm doing a color drop to add in all of my values and everything. So I'm blocking in my underpainting. So I'm making sure I have the darks, the lights, basically just filling up the whole canvas with color to start with. Something that's really nice about working in Procreate, which you can replicate with more traditional analog materials as well, is that it automatically records a time lapse when you draw, which is really nice. When I started working with Procreate and I was sort of developing my style with it, I would study the time lapses. So if I made a piece that I liked, I'd watch the time lapses over and over again to see, like, okay, how did I do that? Like, what was, what were the steps? How was it? So I was really getting my process very efficient. And I think that's really good, not only for time saving and everything, but also I think the finished piece has a look that's a bit more confident and clear and communicating to the viewer, because it doesn't have as many kind of sloppy messing around and overworked sections. So, and obviously, if you're working on an easel, that's something that you can do, set up your phone and record yourself working and then study it. I learned a lot that way. And another nice thing about Procreate is they also will automatically document how long it took you to make the piece and how many brush strokes you used. So it's pretty cool to think that, for me, on average, it's around 2 hours to do a drawing. I've learned it feels like, I lose track of time because I'm in flow state when I'm doing it. So I don't know, but it's really a good thing to know, because if you think, oh, I'm not going to have time to do a drawing tonight, you're like, you know what, I have 2 hours and that's usually how long it takes me. I can do this, or if you're trying to do commissions and figure out how much do you want to charge, it's nice when you have a sense as to how long it really takes you to make these pieces. So it's nice that it does it automatically, so you don't have to think about setting a timer or anything. So I blurred it out, and now what I did was I decided I wanted the background to be a dark blue. So I created a layer and put white underneath so that all my colors would be really vibrant underneath the portrait. And now I've gone through and I'm using the smudge tool with a soft pastel brush to blend all the colors together so they're a little softer. And I'm just cleaning off the edges there. And now I start cross-hatching. And when I work in Procreate and I'm cross-hatching, I work with a palette of 30 colors in Procreate. And I use those same colors in all the pieces that I do. And I came to those colors because I, was trying to figure out what my color palette, I wanted a nice consistent color palette to work from. And so I dated like 7 different portraits. And I made a new palette in Procreate for each one of them. So a new palette of 30 colors. And then when I was finished, I went ahead and I first was like, do I like all these drawings? And I did. So then I took all those palettes and I cross-referenced them to find commonalities. And that's how I ended up with my color palette. And I use the same color palette for all the work that I do. And it's bizarre because I've got, as you can see, some lime green in there, pale purple, hot pink. You know, I really like vibrant colors. I think being a student at the Art Institute around all those impressionists all the time got to me a little bit because I love the idea of the eyes blending the colors together. And I also love the vibrancy that comes between the underpainting layer and the crosshatch layer, because when you have colors that are contrasting colors like that, they vibrate a little bit, you know. I'm sure you've seen things where it's like a bright red background with like bright blue letters or something, and they buzz. There's an energy, right? And so I like, you know, sometimes having that contrast color as the underpainting with the bright colors on top, and there's this energy that comes from it. And I like this kind of messy crosshatch style because, again, it's about the energy. These are people. People move. We're rarely like static still. So I like to have the energy and the motion in there and not make all of the, you know, edges so sharp. And it took me a long time to get to this point with color. I used to be very restrained with color. And because I was taught to paint in a very direct way where, you know, you mix the colors on your palette and then you put it on the canvas, you know, and you paint like a whole section just with one big brush stroke. And that always didn't settle well with me. And I always kind of felt lost with color. I mean, I did it, but I felt kind of, it didn't feel right. Working in this style makes sense to me because when I look at like the sky, if I look in a little section of it, I see like 4 different colors. And so this allows me to be like, what color do I see here? And I can just put it down and then put another color on top and then another color on top. And then to me, in my eyes, it just makes sense. I like to just sort of block in hair sections like the beard there, since they're not the focal point. So I tend to get kind of geometric with those and simple with the rendering. There you go. That is a finished drawing. Let's see. I already talked about wide portraits. So yeah, and then here's another time lapse. This one is a nip print. So you'll see the drawing. It's much faster. You'll see the drawing process. And then with some of the knitting in there. And this is one of the ones that is automatically recorded in Procreate. So you can see sort of the quality of how that's recorded in the app directly without any action needed from me. That just automatically does this. And like I said, I think it's nice studying your time lapses because you can be very efficient, but also very clear. I like to often think about making art like writing or reading or books. You know, it's nice that it's with the library because it makes sense to me that, you know, just as when you write a book, you want to be a clear communicator. Art is a form of communication, and we need to be clear to the viewer so they understand what they're reading in our art. So I like to think about my process and make sure I'm presenting a piece where there isn't any question from the viewer as to whether or not that was supposed to be there. You know, so that's why I like to, you know, study my time lapses, and I like to make sure that everything I'm doing is very clear and intentional so that the viewer doesn't have to question it. They know, you know, what I'm trying to say. And here's some more examples of my drawings. This is the one that we saw earlier, a couple more. Another little time lapse of this one. This is a situation in the Procreate app where you can have the reference photo on the screen. I usually keep it on the side, but you can also have it on the screen if you'd like. Now from drawings, I then put them into my other series. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, people were talking about everything that knitting means to them. And I was seeking ways to incorporate knitting with my portraits. So the first thing I did was I started working on knit prints. And these are some examples of those. The knit prints exist digitally. They start with a drawing. I take the underpainting layer, which is that messy color layer. I turn it into a knitting pattern. I knit it up, then I photograph it and bring it back in under the crosshatch drawing. So here is an example where I did a drawing. I made a knitting pattern, I knitted it, and then I combined them together. When I first started doing that, it was by hand, and it looked like this over on the left side of the screen. It was a mix between stranded intarsia and backwards knitting in order to accomplish that level of color work, because working with 5-6 colors is unusual in knitting. And the way I kept it organized was I had these stitch markers every 10 stitches of different colors. And then in my knitting pattern, every 10 stitches, I would draw a line in that same color so that I knew, like, okay, every stitch until blue is going to be gray. And so I knew that's what color I needed to knit. And then after the blue and the stitch marker, I'd look at the pattern. I was like, okay, now I have to do 2 greens and then 5 grays. And then I knew that's what colors I needed for that next section, etc. Now, after I had been doing the knit prints for a while, I thought, if I did a bunch of knit prints that were together, I could create a knit animation. So then I was like, oh, that's what I want to do next. And so I started incorporating this knitting machine that you see in the center picture here. And this machine is from the 50s. I got it when I worked in a gallery. They were going to throw it away because they didn't know what it was, and it was left over from a previous tenant. I didn't know what it was either when I bumped into it, but then I looked it up and was like, oh, it's a knitting machine, and I had been a hand knitter for a while. So they said I could just take it because they were going to trash it. So I had it for 3 years. I didn't really know how to work with it, but I was mesmerized by it. And then when I wanted to do the knit prints as animations, I knew that I needed to find a way to make the stitches a little bit more consistent, because doing it by hand, it left some stitches really wonky, which is fine for being artwork. And I liked that texture that it brought to it. But for an animation that was going to move, I have my random cross hatching, and then with the stitches, I needed the stitches to calm down a little so it would be more balanced for the viewer. And I knew the knitting machine could give me a more consistent stitch, and it could move faster, speed up the process a little bit, because doing it by hand would have taken months. And so you can see on the bed of this machine, I have colored lines. So it was the exact same idea as what I was doing by hand. I had, a color on the bed and a color on the pattern. And that's how I kept track of where I was on the piece. And here are examples of some of my animations. This one was made on this machine here. So that one has the knitting and then the drawing. That one is about 14 different frames. So 14 different knit fabrics. This one is recently been exhibited with Rendezvous Arts. And so this one is about 30 frames. They're really big, and it's presented as a long film strip in exhibition. And the idea is that if you actually photograph all of them, you would end up with this glitched out animation of this face. I have a real soft spot for technology. It's sort of a sub theme that runs throughout my work and has for a really long time. And I didn't really understand. I sort of had to think about why I was so drawn to technology. I was really drawn to this knitting machine, and I was really excited about working with like the digital drawing tools and everything. And I, had to do some self-reflection on it. And I realized that I sort of, see myself as a bit organic and inorganic, because I've lived my life with metal implants along my spine and in my heart. So I had surgeries when I was in high school. And so I've always lived with these things. And so if it wasn't for science and technology and mechanical things, I wouldn't be able to live my life the way I have been. And so I think I have this nice kind of collaborative life with technology and mechanical things. So to me, it just feels natural that my art making process also reflects that. I also appreciate, so that's why the glitching out is showing up in the pieces. And in this piece, it talks about lifelong learning through tech and time. So in this one, I have the faces side by side, kind of like Zoom calls. And the people who are featured are all women from old family films dating between the 40s and the 70s. And this one is over 100 frames that each frame was knit, and then 200 drawn portraits put together to make the piece. So again, technology is showing up. And then the knitting is there again for that kind of connection between all of us. That white thread continues throughout the entire piece into one long strand of knitting. And then learning and sharing, through technology and time, right? How we learn through each other and we learn through time. We use technology to help and learn from each other. And sometimes we learn things and we have to revisit them. Sometimes we have to break down what we thought we understood and knew and sort of build it up again. And that's why some parts of the film sort of glitch out, or some pieces like unravel and come back together again, because we need to kind of revisit the things that we thought we had figured out, but maybe we should reconsider. That piece was on exhibit at Fiber Art International last year, and it'll be on exhibit at the Museum of Art in Fort Collins at the end of the summer. So I also do knit art pieces, so pieces that exist and are exhibited with the physical knitting. And they feature between 4 to 6 colors of yarn. And sometimes I have them layered beneath vinyl, and they can get up to 7 feet tall. It was difficult to do a project like this before on that first knitting machine I showed you, this one, because it still left long strands of yarn on the reverse of the work. So it was a little too clunky and messy to exhibit, but I'm able to use this knitting machine that I have behind me, which I'll show you a picture of soon. It's from the 80s, and it is a hacked. So it was always meant to work with computers, but I hacked it so it works with contemporary computers now. And so what I'm able to do now with these pieces is I do my drawing in Procreate. I send it to my computer. The program makes a knitting pattern for me that's monochromatic with 6 colors. And then I choose the yarn colors that I want to use for it. And then the computer talks to my knitting machine and it selects the needles for me, but I still have to press the buttons to change the yarn colors and move the carriage back and forth and then push the needles back. So I still have to do sort of a process, but it's a lot faster. And with the 2 needle beds, it makes the back of the fabric really clean. So these are some examples where I've incorporated vinyl with them, where they're a little bit, the knit part is a little simpler. And so I've layered vinyl over it, clear vinyl, and the vinyl is seamed at the top edge of the knitting. And so they can kind of float away from the wall. So they kind of can enter our space, the space of the viewer. And on top of the vinyl, I've done a black and white drawing using graffiti tagging markers. So I think it's also kind of cool that it's like knitting is a really slow art form, but like graffiti tagging is a really fast art form because I have to kind of go in and out and tag things. And these are some of the larger tapestries. So this one here on the left is 7 feet tall. This is a glitched out knit piece. And this one is about, these 2 are about 4 feet pieces. All of them with 6 colors of yarn. Here you can see what the back of the pieces look like. So there's no floats. They're called floats in knitting. They're the long strings of yarn. None of that. It's nice and clean and solid. So it makes them hang really nice as tapestries because the back is very clean and it adds a little weight to the piece so that it's nice and firm and structured. And as I mentioned, this is my knitting machine from the 80s that I have hacked to work with contemporary computers. And here it is in action. So here, this is me binding off with the machine. So there's still some manual things that have to be done with the knitting machine. So when I'm all finished with the piece, this is the process I go to get it off of the machine. And this is me working on the one from the 50s. So with that one, I was using bobbins and I had to kind of color change. And this is what it looks like with those big tapestries. I have to seam them because I can only make them as wide as the knitting bed is, which is 200 stitches. So to make them wide enough, I have to work on them in sections and then seam them together. So a little bit about knitting machines. I have 5 knitting machines, the Brother Profile 550 and 551, which is the green one that you see here. And the 550 is a slightly simpler version of it. And then the one from the 80s that you saw in action is the KH930 with the KR850 ribber. And then I have a Singer Studio 360, which is a machine from the 70s. It has a punch card. And then I made myself a circular sock knitting machine, which I'll show you in a second. But a couple of things about knitting machines, that knitting machines will not do the work for you. So as you saw, like that's how I take it off the machine and I have to man it the whole time. It's not like a 3D printer where you put in what you want and then you can walk away or sleep. I have to sit at the machine the whole time and work the carriage and manually do the colors and everything. But they will keep the stitches very consistent. So the tension will be nice and consistent. The flat bed machines are very versatile. So that's what these machines are called, that are flat instead of circular. They're very versatile. They can do tons of things. You can make sweaters, socks, hats, gloves, all sorts of things on them. They can do a lot of really cool things. They can be used in conjunction with hand knitting. So as long as you make sure that your gauge is similar between the two, you can do, for example, if you see this pattern for a cardigan you really want to make because the lace pattern on the front looks so fun to do, but you really don't want to do the sleeves because you've done 100 sleeves before, then you can do the front of the cardigan by hand. And as long as your gauge is consistent between the machine and your hand knitting, you can then go on the knitting machine and bust out those sleeves in a couple of hours and then just be done with your sweater. So you don't have to be stuck on Sleeve Island trying to bust those out. They are fast. Knitting machines are quick. They do speed up the process. And something I think is important about knitting machines, which, you know, I don't hear a lot of people talk about, but I think it makes knitting accessible to those with hand dexterity challenges. I know you saw in the one image me, you know, casting off my project, but with a machine like the one I have from the 80s that's hacked, there's a lot of different accessories you can get to streamline even more of those minute processes. So then, you know, you can adjust it to your needs. So if you're someone who really loves knitting and maybe you lost the use of one of your hands or something, this is another option for you where you can still be creative and be expressive and do things that you love. Can provide some really good options for you. And these types of machines are readily available. I often see them up on like eBay and OfferUp and stuff like that for good prices. These are my other machines. So this is the one I was talking about from the 80s that's computerized. This one is from the 70s. It is not electronic. It has the punch card machine. It's a punch card machine. So you can see the punch card right there. And then that is the sock knitting machine that I made myself. So that was really fun. That was $30 because I was 3D printed. It was really cool. So that's for making socks. And yeah, lots of info here. So this week I've been part of the Rendezvous Arts performing. They have a nice, you know, oboe quartet and then artwork on display. And so I'm their artist this month. So we've already had 2 performances and the final one is on Wednesday in Dixon. I am an instructor with Sketchy for their 30 days, 30 faces and Procreate lessons. So it's a really cool system where for 30 days you get a video lecture demonstration with a portrait artist and it varies every day. So it's really cool because you can learn from all these different artist styles, which is really fun. So I did 3 lessons in that series. As I mentioned, that animation is going to be on exhibit at the Museum of Art in Fort Collins. So that'll be this summer. I also have 2 pieces up at this mini exhibit in the Ukraine. And so that's going up this summer as well. And then that's my social media handles. And this is something I want to talk about, which is AI image generators. So I learned that 50 pieces of my artwork have been used to train AI image generators without my consent or payment. So I was not very happy about that. There are lawsuits against those companies for doing that. And I was not able to share my still images online for several months until Glaze, which is what this is, came on the market. Glaze is now available. And what Glaze does is, well, Glaze was created by the University of Chicago, and it's a free program you can get on your computer. And what you can do is you can put your images in there, and they're going to cloak them so that if an AI image generator pulls your images off the internet to try to train their computers, it's going to mess up the image that they get from it. So they can't make images that look like your artwork or your photos. So I highly recommend everybody just take a few minutes and just glaze your images before you put it on the internet. Because yeah, they got me from all angles. They got my website, they got me from press, they got me from international magazines, they got me from Pinterest. So any image I had on the internet, they took. So it was really upsetting. And here's an example of what they look like. So these are images that have been glazed. These are images that have not been glazed. So you can see how from the naked eye and looking at them, you can't tell the difference. When I zoom in, I can tell the difference. I can see little subtle differences. But as you can see, just on a computer screen or on your phone or on social media, no one's going to know the difference, you know? So yeah. That is all. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Faith.
Sure.
I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone did too. And thank you for sharing that information about glaze. That's really
yeah.
Absolutely. So if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A. Faith is available to answer. And that's amazing how you do your work.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. For someone who's not an artist, amazing. Susie, I'd like to know, how did you find out your images were used?
There's a website called Have I Been Trained? So if you go to Have I Been Trained, you can see if any of your images, including photos, they have medical records on there too. Basically any photo that's been on the internet, they have scraped. So there's, a chance that some of the other stuff is on there. It's haveibeentrained.com. You can do an image search or a text search to see if you can find your images. I started with text searches because I was, of course, like, I don't want to put more images out there. But I ended up needing to do the image search as well in order to catch them all because I was in international press. So some of the tags associated with my images weren't in English, so they weren't coming up. So that's how I found out. And then through that, you can opt out, but they say they got confirmation from one of the training sources to not use the opt-out images. But on the other hand, once these AI image generators once these bots have learned from your artwork, they've learned from them, so there's kind of no going back, so it kind of isn't really a perfect system, but it's something you can do at least so that you can take some action and you can know if your work's been used. It's heartbreaking when I look through it though, because there's so many beautiful artworks in there. And it's so sad when I'm like, oh, they probably have no idea that their artwork is being used this way. And if I see a name I recognize, I've sent them a message on Instagram, like, hey, in case you don't know, your art's being used for this,
We have 2 questions, very, very similar. If you could explain more about how you translate the image to the knit pattern from the Procreate art.
Sure. So there's 2 ways that I do that. One way is I use a program on my iPad called Stitch Sketch. And so it's really easy. It will go ahead and make it'll make the knitting pattern for me. So I can just go in this app and I can put in the photo of my artwork and it'll turn it into a pattern. And they do knitting patterns, crochet patterns, perler bead patterns, like they can kind of customize it to the medium that you're working with. So that's one way that I do it, is with that app. The other way, when I use my computerized knitting machine, I have an application on my computer that I use that, you know, once I put my photo into that program, that is the program that's going to talk to the knitting machine. So that's going to do it all for me. That program is called Image to Track. Well, IMG2 Track is the application that I use. There's also Design in It, but Design in It is more expensive than Image to Track and a bit more complicated. And I really like the output I get from Image to Track a lot better.
Thank you. Would you recommend the Sketchy course for folks that are new to digital art and portraits, or is there an easier intro for portraits?
I think it's a great opportunity because there's so many different instructors and artists who are teaching that you can really learn a lot from them. And because you're drawing along with them, you kind of get to learn side by side with them while they're working. It's really nice. It's a nice course. And the Sketchy community is it's my favorite social media, because once you finish your pieces, you share them on the app. And everyone, it's just artist to artist. So everyone's just really encouraging and really supportive. And it's just a happy place to be. It's a good community. Even if you don't, maybe you want to start with the app first and then like see what the vibe is like, and you'll see like how cozy and wonderful it is and creative and inspiring. And then you might want to take one of the courses.
Awesome. There's a question about the back of your knits. Are the pieces double knit, or is there another technique?
It's called double bed jacquard. So what's happening is, let's see if I can pull up my knitting machine. There we go. So this is the back of the piece. So the knitting, the top of the bed, so that's like a top of a bed. That's a different machine, but that's the top of the bed. So that's up here, is doing the picture, and it's facing the wall. The picture faces the wall. And this is the back of the piece, and it's being knitted on this second bed of needles here. And the fabric that's being created falls between the two layers of needle beds. And so for every time I pass my carriage across the needle bed, it knits every other stitch on the reverse of the work. And then it'll select the needles on the top bed that need to be in the color. So then when I move the carriage from the right side to the left side, it knits all those needles it selected on the top bed. So really when I'm passing it, it's knitting every other on the bottom, and then it knits the ones that are the right color on the top. So it kind of all becomes this really thick, solid fabric.
Very cool. A question about your sock. Is the sock machine pattern, is it available anywhere?
For the sock knitting machine, yes. If you go to Thingiverse, you can find the pattern for the machine. Yeah, it's all right there. So anyone can go make it. Yeah, it was awesome. I didn't have to do much alterations to it. I only had to purchase, the little hardware pieces for it. I happen to already have those table legs in my house, and the circular piece of wood in my house. I already had those. And so I just needed to buy the little pieces of hardware. And there was one rubber band. It's not a rubber band. You could use a rubber band, but I wanted to use the metal spring for a round tier, which helps keep the needles in place. And in the Thingiverse pattern, they tell you exactly what you need. So it's super easy. So it takes a little time. You have to be organized. Oh, and I had to buy the row counter right here, which helps like how many times it turns around in a circle. But like I said, it's all right there in the Thingiverse pattern. Yeah.
Wow. And
it works great. It's awesome. Yeah. To buy like a 3D printed knitting machine, stock knitting machine made by somebody else, it's like $800, $900. And this was like just some patience and like $30. And, and I love tinkering with things. So for me, there was like so much fun.
That is amazing. And all of these resources are amazing. And I will share this with everyone in a follow-up email, all these websites that Faith is referencing. So thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Oh, where does the printing happen?
Which printing? Maybe,
3D, I think.
Oh, the 3D printing?
Yes, that's what she was asking.
Oh, I have a 3D printer in my studio. It's really simple. It's just an Ender Dragon 3 printer. I don't know. Do you guys have a maker lab in your library?
We have a tech center where we do have a 3D printer.
Okay.
So our participant who, if you're local, please feel free to stop by the library and we can definitely show you. They're not super big, so they can fit, pretty much, on a desk. So depending on how big you're going. Very cool. Any other questions? Oh, here's a comment. I'm impressed with your analytical approach to your work. Did your arts administrative studies influence this?
I think so. I mean, I think what was nice about my arts administration background and working in museums and galleries is I'm very concerned about the viewer's experience, and I'm very interested in artist communication and making sure that's clear. I mean, in my different roles, I've done things like, tour people through contemporary art museums and, children and adults and people of all sorts of different backgrounds who have different experiences with art and explaining it to them, and sometimes really abstract pieces. And so, I'm really interested in how people move through spaces and how people see artwork and what kind of questions they come up with. And like I said, I see art as communication. I think about it like books and reading, and how like when we write an essay, we try to be very clear. So with my art, I try to be very clear and intentional, because I think what I saw with visitors to museums was if the artwork didn't look totally confident, they weren't really sure if the artist intended to do that, they wouldn't speak about it. They wouldn't say something because they weren't sure, So I think that's something that's important with art making. It's something that, like, as I've developed my style, I try to make sure it's very clear what I'm trying to communicate.
Absolutely. Another question came in, the plastic overlay drawing on your knitting pieces, how does that get printed?
Oh, these pieces, I knit them the normal way, and then I freehand draw on the vinyl. So it's a really heavyweight vinyl. So I tested a few different vinyls to see which one I liked the best. This one's a really heavy vinyl, so it's not prone to wrinkling, and it sits really flat. There's still like an airiness between layers, but it sits down. It doesn't kind of float away. And yeah, and then I freehand the drawing on there.
Awesome. Someone's asking if we could have details on the neuroaesthetics book mentioned earlier, please.
Ooh, let's see. I don't have it in front of me. It's in the other room, but I can email you what the book is. It was from MIT Press.
Yes, if you could email that to me, I can definitely send that title to everyone who's watching.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, like I said, I've been really fascinated with, how our brains respond to the visual information that we're given.
Any other questions coming in? I don't see any, so this may be a good time to stop. Okay. Well, I don't see any more. Well, thank you, Faith, so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing your work. You're so talented. Thank you for sharing your work and your method with us. And a huge thank you to the DuPage Art League for arranging these programs and for your partnership. And everyone is commenting on your adorable dog who's sitting perfectly
on the table.
Perfectly behaved, very well trained. So thank you so much, Faith, and everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Night.